Hello and welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Peter.
So this week I want to talk about the psychology behind wokeness, or woke supremacy, as we often like to call it here at Going Dark. So the first question I have for you guys, Jack and Peter, is what is so appealing about wokeness? Why has it spread so quickly? How did it get so popular and so ingrained in our society and culture so fast?
Well, I'm going to start with a quote from Jordan Peterson. And part of it goes, it means to be an adult, adopting the burden of self-conscious vulnerability and accepting the end of the unconscious paradise of childhood, where finitude and morality are only dimly comprehended. It means undertaking the sacrifices necessary to generate a productive and meaningful reality. So I bring that up because he talks about the unconscious, and he often says in lectures that people that rely on alcohol or drugs to reach a state of unconsciousness are doing so because they're almost retreating into a childlike mentality where it's all about sensation seeking and they don't want to face the realities of life. We've often heard this term, but it's more about sort of putting a block or a damper on the burden and the responsibility that the day-to-day existence requires. And so when I think about modern wokeness, it's sort of generational. This happens in many generations, but this new form looks different, but it still, I think, relates to the idea that they don't want to grow up.
Well,
right?
what I'm hearing there, Jack, is, and I think that quote's actually very interesting in the way you framed it. It sounds like wokeness is a drug. It's basically because people do drugs, they do heroin, they watch porn, they do addictive, expedient things. I think it's rule number 6 or something in 12 Rules for Life is do what's expedient. Or do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Yeah. People do these things. They do these drugs or drug-like things because it helps them disengage from the hard questions of life and the hard decisions of life. And so when I hear this, and tell me if this kind of goes along with your interpretation and why you brought up that quote, which I actually do think is really interesting. To me, I'm hearing wokeness is sort of a drug that people get high on because it helps them detach from the reality in which they cannot simply boil down every single hard decision and hard topic in life to, I am a victim, people, I deserve sympathy, I deserve certain advantages, I deserve certain reparations, in the general sense of the term. I actually think that's a really interesting way of putting it. I mean, we've called wokeness a conspiracy theory, we've called it a religion, we might talk about that more today, but to call it almost like a drug, I actually think is a really interesting way of framing it. Because as somebody who used to be pretty woke, because I used to be pretty fucking woke. Like I used to, constantly look for ways to call out people, especially conservatives, or like racism, sexism. You get high on it. Like you see all the likes on Facebook and Twitter and you're like, oh, fuck yeah, And it helps you disengage from all of these questions. And I think particularly, and maybe I didn't have this aspect as much as a white male, but I think if you're an ethnic minority or a woman, the victimization part is really the drug part because it allows you to just inject yourself, if you will, for the sake of the metaphor, with victimization. It helps you go, okay, there's this thing in my life that isn't going right. And boy, does it feel good to, instead of doing a proper reflection on that, to instead just boil it down to, well, I'm a victim. Somebody's oppressing me and that's totally out of my control.
Yeah. It's not an exact one-to-one, but it's pretty close in my mind because I know family members that would drink to relieve stress from work or hating their bosses, feeling like they're a victim and they're not in control of their own lives, right? So they rely on these substances. And similarly, in colleges, we see students going to puppy rooms because they heard something that triggered them. And so now they need to be around something that's very childlike, I would say, being around puppies, being in a safe room, and not confronting the deeper issue.
So there's a regression aspect to it as well.
Yes.
Which you do see with the people who are the most... They got like stage 4 wokeness. The people who are like, you see them screaming at Jordan Peterson, the generic SJW people, they really do have an arrested development issue where like they're not able to function. Like a lot of woke people, they're still able to function in adult society. Like maybe they just shut their damn trap when they're at work and, they're still able to have friendships maybe with people who aren't completely like them. But you do have the people where it's like their development is so stunted because they just fell into this ideology, which is also kind of a drug. And you do see the stunted development of people who get addicted to alcohol at a young age, or certainly marijuana. You see them just not maturing in the same ways.
Yeah, I think to potentially even build on this this analogy that we've started creating here. I believe it was Adrienne Brown, so she's a pretty, I guess, pretty woke activist. Last year, wrote a book titled "Pleasure Activism," and this, as far as I can tell, the thesis of the book is trying to merge hedonism and social justice, and saying social justice should be this very pleasurable experience, and in many ways, like doing a drug is a pleasurable experience. By making it more pleasurable, it becomes easier to spread. And I think you see a lot of parallels maybe with 1960s culture, where part of it fell apart because, if you're living that, sex, drugs, music lifestyle, well, you don't actually get anything done in your life, and you end up a lot weaker as a result of embracing that tribe or meme or whatever else. And I think also the analogy with the drug, it comes in very handy in another regard with regards to why it's been able to spread so much. And this potentially goes back to all the mimetic theory stuff that remember to edit that out. I think it goes back to a lot of mimetic theory, where the ideas that spread aren't necessarily the most meritocratic ones, but the ones that are best at spreading. So in a sense that because wokeness has become so widespread and ingrained in our culture, kind of the primary thing we know about it is that it's really good at spreading. And perhaps this drug-like, whether it pleasurable or almost like guilty pleasure, or kind of this self-destructive aspect to it, a lot of people find very appealing as to whether it potentially meets other needs they're not getting, or becomes a way to withdraw from the rest of the world. So I think there's a lot of different avenues that we see kind of overlapping with this analogy.
Yeah, I think this kind of gets me thinking about what you just said, Peter, about the fact that it spreads so easily, and that's like one of its primary traits, the mimetic nature of wokeness. It got me thinking about what I think is one of the best pieces of intellectual dark web content that there is, which is a video of a speech Brett Weinstein gave, and it's called "How the Magic Trick is Done." And I recommend to our audience looking it up. It's a really great speech that Brett Weinstein gave, where he talks about wokeness, and he talks about it in the context of not really being an ideology at all, but rather it is a tactic, that it is a set of tactics with a very political goal, rather
mimetic theory, where the ideas that spread aren't necessarily the most meritocratic ones, but the ones that are best at spreading. So in a sense that because wokeness has become so widespread and ingrained in our culture, kind of the primary thing we know about it is that it's really good at spreading. And perhaps this drug-like, whether it pleasurable or almost like guilty pleasure, or kind of this self-destructive aspect to it, a lot of people find very appealing as to whether it potentially meets other needs they're not getting, or becomes a way to withdraw from the rest of the world. So I think there's a lot of different avenues that we see kind of overlapping with this analogy.
Yeah, I think this kind of gets me thinking about what you just said, Peter, about the fact that it spreads so easily, and that's like one of its primary traits, the mimetic nature of wokeness. It got me thinking about what I think is one of the best pieces of intellectual dark web content that there is, which is a video of a speech Brett Weinstein gave, and it's called "How the Magic Trick is Done." And I recommend to our audience looking it up. It's a really great speech that Brett Weinstein gave, where he talks about wokeness, and he talks about it in the context of not really being an ideology at all, but rather it is a tactic, that it is a set of tactics with a very political goal rather than really a moral goal. That it's all, ironically, it's all about power, which makes sense actually when you think about the sort of postmodern underpinnings. And what he was really saying, and what got me thinking about this, was the whole thing. And this might be part of why it can't really last very long, because it doesn't actually have any kind of like logical or moral center. You see such terrible things happening as a result of wokeness, and you see so many contradictions playing out in the real world. One of the most obvious of which is the whole thing where feminists are now, going up against the transgender community for what is essentially sexual appropriation. But anyway, these contradictions happen because the whole thing is just designed to spread and to win culture skirmishes. It's not really designed to do anything other than win. Like, if you have a genuine ideology, when you enter into a debate with someone, it's going to look a lot more legitimate. Like a debate between a genuine liberal and conservative who have ideological motives where they want to make their ideology the most solid and the most sort of logically sound. It's going to sound very different than what we typically hear out of woke people, which is relying on these tactics, such as Bret Weinstein says in his speech. He says the tactic of simply lowering the bar of what racism is and then saying that only white people can be racist, which puts white people at a disadvantage in a sort of power struggle. And it's all about this power struggle. And that's because the end goal, if there is one, is to flip the reins of oppression, which is a political goal. It's not a moral goal.
And you know what? Power and winning feel really good.
Yeah.
And very much like a drug. And I think there are these psychological studies where, you give people power, you give them more and more power, and it starts becoming like an addiction, like cocaine. It changes your psychology. It kind of changes how you view the world. And I think one of the wonderful innovations that's come out of liberalism in general is this, I suppose the core of the ideology is to limit any concentrations of power, sort of whether they're in individuals or institutions. That's why a system of checks and balances was created, is to prevent these concentrations of power. And like you said, if wokeness is essentially a series of tactics aimed at the pursuit of power, that clashes very quickly with sort of liberal ideas in terms of anything truth-seeking or meritocratic.
And the greatest check on unchecked factional power is freedom of speech. It's the notion that unpopular speech, that woefully unpopular speech which is maybe only supported by a small fraction of the population, the idea that you would protect that speech so that it can exist, so that it can merely exist without being stomped on by the state or by the society at large. That moral and legal and governmental value, that political value that we have, is the ultimate check. It is the ultimate cornerstone of our liberal democracy. It's the ultimate check on unchecked factional power. And what do you see with woke supremacy? It is the antithesis of freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is the antithesis of it.
I don't mean to condescend when we talk about people like this, but if you compare it again to a child who's being forced to eat broccoli by their parent, what do? They cry and they'll throw the food on the floor and they shut it down. That's what they are doing with speakers at colleges they don't agree with, right? Like Ben Shapiro, we've shut him down. We didn't want to take the broccoli. We didn't want to hear what we wanted to hear. And so again, to Peter's point, we're gaining power and that feels really good in the moment. But the reason I can condescend with these people is because this is not the 1960s. We're not dealing with, in most cases, legitimate civil rights issues. And so how can you do anything but call them children for the way they're behaving?
Well, and just like broccoli, free speech is good for you. It's like, it's good for it's, and just like broccoli, free speech can be kind of, unpleasant. Yes. You know what I mean? Like broccoli might not be fun to eat. Like it's not as fun to eat as fucking hot dogs, right? But it's better for you. And in the long run, it's something that you need. If you never eat a fucking vegetable, you're going to fucking die. Yeah. And what we're seeing is the death of our discourse because it's not eating any goddamn broccoli. It's eating hot dogs and shit, which is your BuzzFeed quiz that tells you which fucking Game of Thrones character has your political ideology. Spoiler alert, they're all woke. It's like if that's where our politics is, it's the brain death of our discourse. And it's because there's no nutritional value in our discourse. And it's because you have this faction of the woke supremacists who just refuse to do any of the things that we know, just like we know eating fruits and vegetables is good for your body. We know that free speech is good for our body politic and our society. And they're trying to reject it. It really is like saying, I'm only going to eat fucking ice cream. Like I'm only going to do the things that feel really good. I'm only going to listen to the opinions I agree with. I'm only going to do the things that get me power and make other people look bad and help me dominate them in debates and, own them and have mic drop moments. It's like just eating ice cream all day.
Yeah.
Feels really, really good, and then eventually you fucking die, which is what's happening to our democracy.
But I'd caution to say this is, I guess, entirely due to, say, the woke movement and their tactics. Because, I mean, if you look at increases in political polarization, decreases in public discourse, trust in institutions, those are in a very long-term decline. I do feel there potentially is an inflection point or a tipping point with sort of the adoption and the widespread adoption of woke tactics, woke ideology. But it seems like it's been a longer term trend in that we have seen this in society in the US going back at least a few decades. So I think there are some sort of underlying problems potentially, and potentially what wokeness is kind of this breaking point where, you know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was still the potential for debate, still the potential for, you know, working across the aisle with people who are ideologically different from you. But as soon as you kind of go all in on identity politics, all in on wokeness, you almost give up any potential for cooperation. But even 5 or 6 years ago, cooperation wasn't great. So I think it's new, and it's certainly more dangerous than what existed, but it does seem to be part of a longer trend.
So what were some of those other pre-existing causes of the decline in our democratic values and institutions and our liberal values and institutions? Like if it wasn't wokeness, was it a sort of proto-wokeness? Was it something completely unrelated? Like I hear you, Peter, and I agree that there were, you saw the beginning of extreme political polarization really in the 90s, as I understand it. And this means it also predates the internet, although not by a lot. The internet got pretty fully commercialized in the late, aughts, in around like 2009, 2010. So could you say the internet and the social media is a factor that is not necessarily inherently woke? I mean, what other factors could there be?
So I think a major one is, potentially just individual preferences, right? So they do these studies where they look at, say, career choices between men and women in super gender equal countries. So they went and did this study in Sweden, and they found out that men and women choose almost entirely different careers. And there are careers that are 90% men and careers that are 90% women. And that's, the more equal the country is in terms of its opportunities, the more people choose differently. Mm-hmm. And I think potentially what's happened in the US, and this is kind of common in lots of liberal countries that are potentially also multicultural, a lot of times people want to, they want to live around other people who are like them, whether it's, kind of most simplistically would be by race, but probably much more by class or by ideology and beliefs. And like that's just people's individual preference. Like they want the people to interact with to be like them across some important dimension of their lives. And as kind of society has gotten freer, global immigration opened up, we see people self-selecting into communities of very like-minded people. And then now all of a sudden, well, you're not, you no longer have these towns which are sort of ideologically diverse, or maybe not ideologically diverse, but if you are, let's say, a gay guy in Indiana 50 years ago, you probably don't have quite the same opportunities to, say, move to the coasts as you do today. Today, chances are you're going to move to some big blue city. And so those communities aren't as exposed to sort of different people anymore. And that's true also of the communities in the coast, where you have people who are very ideologically similar through whatever ideology they've adopted, and they just don't interact with sort of the middle class families in Central America. Sorry, Middle America. Central America, whole other story. So I think part of it is just those sort of decades of individual choices by people who are, they just want to be around other people who are like them. And potentially it's reached a tipping point where they can't even cooperate because they want sort of the right of self-determination, and the other group is for whatever reason saying, no, you can't, it's like you can't ban abortions here. Or they're saying, oh, you can't ban guns here, where there are a lot of people living all in the same areas, surrounded by people who think just like them, who want those exact policies. And that's, I think, a really difficult challenge that we're facing.
So would it be accurate, Peter, to summarize that thesis as I understand it? And I want you to correct whatever I'm sort of leaving out in this summary. Would it be accurate to say that our ailing democracy is to some extent a result of extreme levels of self-selection, which are exacerbated in the environment created by a failed experiment in multiculturalism?
I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to blame multiculturalism, because I think this could potentially even happen with relatively sort of, I guess, racially or religiously homogenous cultures. I think there's even a divide. Let's say if you just look at white America, I think there's a pretty strong divide. Just
There's a class
just
divide.
there, and it's a class divide, but it has a lot of other components as well with
bit of
regards to
religion.
social issues and religion.
Yeah.
So, and I think that divide is perhaps not quite as deep, but I think it's still quite deep. So I wouldn't, the only edit I would make is not to say it is based on multiculturalism. I think it is sort of just a natural evolution of freeing human preferences.
This is a critical issue that we're talking about because on the one hand, we often support homogenous communities that have stuck to traditional values over time, and that builds the social cohesion of the community. But at the same time, if you're not exposed to different ideas or competing ideas, then you start to ossify, right? Your institutions and your ideas, they become rigid and eventually they will crumble themselves. So it's sort of finding that balance in our own communities where we want that cohesion, but we also want to hear other ideas so that we don't build those bubbles. And social media, you're able to create the bubbles. There's very few competing ideas, but even within those online communities, what are the values?
Yeah, and what you said, Jack, really makes me think about, you mentioned something about finding the balance, and the balance as it pertains to having social and political cohesion and shared values, but at the same time making sure people are exposed to different ideas and that there's a certain amount of intellectual diversity that exists within a culture which has a very basic foundation where people tend to agree on some very basic things. It's sort of like, and this is something that comes up in, conversations in the intellectual dark web a lot. People can disagree on, how to solve problems, but they shouldn't disagree on how we discuss solving those problems. Like there should be a general agreement on the rules of engagement for, let's say how we discuss immigration, i.e. one rule is you don't just get to call the other side racist because they don't want, masses of unchecked immigration from other countries where political and social values just are not the same. They're just not. Like the political and social values of the Muslim world are just not the same as ours.
So I think this is actually where wokeness is such a scary break, because I think until, say, somewhat recently, we have agreed to a large extent on the rules of engagement, even though there's been increasing disagreement about what the outcomes should be. And I think with the advent of woke tactics and sort of this unambiguous, they don't even hide that they're after power, right? That's like kind of baked into the ideology. It has this authoritarian sort of like reign of terror, like cancel culture type of feel to it, and it is essentially a totally different set of tactics that says, let's tear down the whole structure. We totally reject it. And we're going to try to essentially impose our will on people who disagree with us rather than convincing them in some, through some discourse that we have a superior position for whatever reason. And I think that's the scary break that we're facing right now.
And it's what you just said, I think is so true, Peter. And I agree 100% that was a huge turning point, was the break in those shared values around very basic notions of liberal democracy, where we try to convince each other through rational discourse into our positions, saying that we're not going to do that anymore because that's, foul logocentrism or whatever the fuck they say. That is so antithetical to democracy that it's resulted in me making a major shift. I went from being, my political shift has had a lot to do with this realization, in that I went from being pretty woke myself to thinking that wokeness was misguided, or to declaring it a misguided attempt at legitimately trying to problem solve around issues of, race and gender, to now I'm going, okay, there are liberal and conservative solutions to, race and gender related issues and identity related issues. Wokeness is just poison. It is a nonsense thing where people come in and they're not proposing solutions. They're proposing some kind of authoritarian idea, like, we're going to censor the speech of people that have one particular opinion on this issue. I've gotten to this point where, because of what we were just saying about how wokeness takes the basic foundations of discourse and says, no, we're not even going to fucking do that. It is not liberal. It is not conservative. I call it just intellectual poison. It's something totally different from the leftism or progressivism that a lot of people said sort of underpins wokeness. These ideas of we need to create an equal society on the basis of race, sex, gender, all of that. It's kind of, I don't really see what the connection is, because you'll see classical liberals and conservatives actually propose like rational solutions to these problems, and then that's never good enough, because it doesn't come from this ideological standpoint where white people are bad and they're oppressive, and black people are these victims who need to rise up and flip the reins of oppression. Like, it is so focused on power, and it's so not focused on the cornerstone of our democracy, which is rational discourse and incorporating logic into our laws the way that the founding fathers did. I mean, so many of those ideas are so brilliant that we had initially in our justice system and in our system of government. They're just logically very consistent. The rejection of those values, I have started to say, is just, it's poison. So what I'm trying to say here is, don't put up with wokeness even a little bit. Like, I don't like it when people pay lip service. I've heard people in the intellectual dark web do this thing where it's like, oh, well, I think it comes from a good place and I think some of these issues are legitimate. No. For me, it's like, you're talking about liberalism or maybe progressivism. When you talk about wokeness, what we are talking about is a sense of moral superiority that is, and virtue, which is advertised in an attempt to create this us versus them war situation, this culture war situation where people are trying to flip the reins of oppression. Like, that's what wokeness is. And I think it should be redefined. And that's why we've started using the term woke supremacy on our channel a little bit, because it really is a supremacy thing. Like, if your ideology does not include or allow for rational discourse, it's not an ideology. It's a power grab. It's an authoritarian movement, which should be called a supremacist movement.
So I think I agree with a lot of what you said there. Certainly a little depressing to hear all at once. I think when we talk about liberalism and when you talk about flipping the reins of oppression, I think the beauty of liberalism is there should be no reins of oppression, right? And that shouldn't be about flipping the reins of oppression. It shouldn't be about nobody having those reins of oppression. No, I guess individual in society. This also has me wondering about, say, oppressing I guess oppressing might not be a strong word here, but sort of filtering ideas out, because if we kind of use this analogy of it being a poison potentially being spread by the internet, so the internet kind of opened the floodgates to, I would say, a lot of hateful ideologies. And I think wokeness in a lot of ways is a very hateful ideology. And and we also kind of see this sort of in the neo-reactionary movement as well, where kind of these movements, which would have been totally fringe 10 or 15 years ago, actually have quite substantial audiences today. And in the case of wokeness, significant institutional buy-in. And so it seems like in a lot of ways, either we kind of abdicated the role of gatekeepers, or potentially in the case of universities, they abdicated their own roles in terms of allowing sort of these toxic ideologies into the universities and not serving as a filter, perhaps smuggled in under the guise of benevolence or whatever else. But I think 20, 30 years ago, potentially university administrators should have started saying, no, like we don't subscribe to this ideology. We believe the papers that you are publishing constitute hate speech, and we don't want it included as part of our university canon. And I think potentially that's just been eroded over time to the point where it has become acceptable for a lot of people to espouse such hateful ideologies.
What you just said reminds me so much of something Dave Rubin says. I've always said Dave Rubin doesn't get enough love. He gets a lot of hate, not enough love. Dave Rubin said something that what you just said, Peter, really reminds me of, and that's that there's maybe this burgeoning idea in the intellectual dark web, particularly for Dave Rubin, that is kind of scary, and that's that the establishment of our government, that liberalism as a system was way too vulnerable to this type of assault by wokeness. That like you needed a different system, maybe a more conservative system, maybe a more completely different system. That liberalism, because it was so open in some ways, like there was no way to quash this weird, terrible supremacist movement in its infancy, in the 80s or 90s or whatever, where it started purely in academia. And, because I don't think any of us would advocate for saying, they should have taken the first paper to mention white privilege and just not published it, because that would be considered censorious, right? Like, because we're all generally in the realm of classical liberalism in our ideologies, or like one step removed, because we're in that realm, we're like, we don't want to quash that. Like, that would be wrong. But that is it reminds me of the exhaust pipe in the Death Star. It's like, that's a place where if you live in a society with free and open inquiry, it means that, of course, the thing that comes along with that is there's free and open inquiry for horrible ideas, which can get very popular, as woke supremacy has.
Well, I was going to say that when we grew up and we went to school, typically, even if you went to a Catholic school, other religions were still allowed. You could have a Jewish child or a Hindu child, go to that school. With woke supremacy, it is, in essence, a type of faith, and we've talked about it as a religion previously. So when someone from a different faith comes to a school or an organization, you treat them with respect, and you try not to say anything that's going to offend them or their faith, right? You don't tell them to take off a certain hat because you know that would be greatly offensive, and you can get sued now, and there's a lot of legal ramifications. The woke religion functions similarly in that you don't want to trigger them and you don't want to set them off the wrong way. And so I think I don't think we coddle religions necessarily, but we are coddling these groups that claim to be or function similarly to a religion or a faith.
Well, that's interesting what you bring up, which is that they kind of have these religious protections where if something is woke, it seems like we're protecting it in the same manner we would protect an expression of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, which is like, Ben Shapiro very much supported Ilhan Omar's right, as much as he may detest Ilhan Omar. He supported her right to wear the hijab on the floor of Congress because he said, I want to be able to wear my kippah on the floor of Congress. And we're giving those kinds of protections to woke ideas. So, for instance, the notion that we should be, asking each other our preferred pronouns as part of our introductions, that seemed ridiculous until somebody said, but that's part of wokeness. It has the woke shield, which is kind of like the religious freedom shield. And this is another flaw in liberalism, right? Religious freedom is a cornerstone of liberalism. And yet that means if you basically turn something into a religion, all of a sudden it's super OP, for lack of a better term. It's just overpowered. It has the religious freedom shield. And so I feel like it reminds me of, because what that does is it advertises this tactic that can be used of just, if I just slap the religion label or I make something basically into a religion and I give it that veneer of respect, I can use it to do things I wouldn't otherwise be allowed to do. So it reminded me of something I remember hearing as a kid or like a teenager. I remember reading an article where it was like some student who was of an Eastern religion. It was either Islam or Hinduism. I'm sorry, I can't remember which one, but it was some Eastern religion. In his religion, I think it was a sect of Islam, but I could be wrong on that. It was customary to have a dagger, a ceremonial dagger on you throughout your day. And he went to school with his ceremonial dagger. Now, of course, he didn't intend to stab anybody. He didn't stab anybody. He didn't attack anybody, but he had a fucking knife on him, like in school. And they told him to put it away because it's a fucking knife. just like in a sheath on his hip. And I think he tried to sue them, or he tried to do something where he would still be able to walk around with this fucking dagger. And I was like, no, like, of course you can't do that. Like, cause the whole thing is like, you could say like, oh, my M16 is part of my religion. Like as a straight white Christian male, my M16 is a part of who I am. It is my religious freedom. It is my religious freedom to have this M16. You know, like somebody could do that. Like,
so I think you bring up a really good point here in that somebody needs to draw the line somewhere. And I think what we needed potentially, 20 years ago was a Jordan Peterson. And yes, the line will be arbitrary, but I think we need some level of arbitrariness in terms of liberalism kind of being a self-preserving as opposed to a vulnerable ideology. And, I think, back in, the 19th century, Karl Marx gave some great critiques of capitalism, but I think liberal democratic capitalism has been in many ways able to account for those critiques and potentially even overcome them in many ways. So it was kind of good having those critiques and then potentially incorporating them into, say, social democratic experiments, say that we have in Europe now. I don't think Western democratic liberalism has yet to account for the fascist critiques of the 20th century. And I think one of them is how do you deal with these toxic ideologies that will abuse the openness of your society and without essentially collapsing the liberal premise to begin with, because you can say, oh, well, you're suppressing my right to speech, or you're suppressing my right to carry a dagger. Well, that freedom has to have limits somewhere. And I think there do need to be somewhat arbitrary limits to liberalism. And we haven't done a very good job, I think, in the West of incorporating those critiques.
It is a really hard thing to do, because I'm sitting here, I'm like, how do you draw that line? Like in terms of religious freedom, I don't know if religious freedom can be a thing without being abused. I don't even know if it should be a thing. I think you should have freedom of speech, but then I don't know if you should be able to say that because something is religious in nature that it should be permitted on that basis alone. For me, it's like, yeah, I also think Ilhan Omar should be able to wear hijab on the Senate floor, because who gives a fuck? It's a fucking hat. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the basis for that. Like, I don't think she should be able to say like, oh, well, I'm Muslim, she should let me wear this. I don't think Ben Shapiro should be able to say I'm Jewish, let me wear my kippah. I think they should be able to say it's a fucking hat, relax. Like, I just think maybe the way we deal with at least the freedom of religion thing is we just get rid of it. We just say like, you can still do stuff that is religious, but you have to have a different reason to justify it than just it's a religious custom.
But I think the difference with wokeness is that when you look at Islam, when you look at sort of these organized religions, they have long histories and kind of deep traditions that teach all kind, compassionate and forgiveness and really kind of wonderful ideas. And, whether you look at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, those ideas are pretty firmly rooted at the core of that religion. And you can kind of point to something and say, you're not being compassionate, you're not recognizing humility, you're not, supporting the grace of God or whatever else. You kind of have a response to why, potentially a moral framework as to why they might not be acting in good faith here, literally. With wokeness, that doesn't exist because of its sole concern with power. And I think that's kind of what makes it different from religion, where religion generally subscribes to a higher moral code, whereas wokeness is very firmly rooted in this postmodern view of it's all power games. Mm-hmm. And that's really where I see the danger. And so I'm pretty okay being like, well, you can have formal religions that have these long traditions and freedom of all that, but hey, if you don't subscribe to the 10 Commandments, well, then you're just faking it. You're not you can't make up religions. And I think wokeness in many ways tries to be in that, compassionate sphere, but it is just totally weaponized compassion. Like it's about the power. It's not about the compassion.
Yeah, this is why we defended faith and why we said we still need faith in society. Religion is not something you tear down. Wokeness is about deconstruction. It's about postmodernism. So you can't necessarily build a movement on that. But I wanted to make a point that I think another reason in terms of psychology why they're drawn to these groups is because, like all humans, we're social animals and we need a sense of belonging. And so you may find that in a woke crowd that, they may coddle you and they may say everything's okay. We're going to validate every feeling you have. Anytime someone treats you wrongly, they are the victimizer and you are the victim. And so you create this community of, in many cases, children, right? Just a bunch of people that want to come be together, be free, and not face the kinds of consequences that they feel are oppressive.
And one of the ways that woke supremacists have a tendency to really weaponize that need for belonging, something that I've really been disturbed by and been affected by personally, is the way that they say, like, okay, we're going to become this community. You know, like there are friend groups on college campuses that are friends because they met at, you know, like the feminist collective meeting, or at this point I would just say the fucking college Democrats, you know, like at some meeting where the connection they had was like, okay, we're woke and together we're going to hang out and make fun of Republicans. And that's kind of how we connect, which, by the way, guilty. I've done that a little bit myself because I was in the college Democrats. So you have that kind of sense of belonging that is created in these social groups. The LGBTQ clubs are absolutely, all they do is sit around all day and talk about being, I mean, I'm sorry, I've been around these individuals, by the way. It's not based on total bullshit. There are literally entire friend groups where it's just like, we're all queer and that's kind of our thing, which, you know, think what you want about that. But my point is merely that you have these groups that where, as you said, Jack, they create the sense of belonging. They have this group, but the real point of what I'm trying to say is there's something so insidious that they do after that, which is they have these woke social groups to create a sense of belonging and draw people in and get new recruits. And then they identify other groups. They go, oh, there's another group that we don't really have an in with because that group is in some way kind of opposed to wokeness, namely groups that are artistic in nature. So maybe you have a gaming club or a cinema club, an art club like that, you know, a club that is based around, let's just use the examples of like movies and video games. And this is where my personal connection comes in. You had the gaming community. It was a community that was in many ways kind of opposed to wokeness. The gaming community, there's something very politically incorrect about it. You're talking about people who spend a lot of their time, you know, chopping off the virtual heads of zombies and shooting the fuck out of people and calling each other the N-word on Xbox Live and doing things that are distinctly unwoke. And there was a certain politically incorrect sense of humor that went along with being a part of the gamer community, as I was and to some extent still am. And then I think that the woke community, and to really a large extent the feminist community, the intersectional feminist community, which is maybe they're one and the same, that's arguable, kind of identifies these groups like the gaming community and goes, I want that. The way that Hitler saw Poland and was like, give me. It was like, they just see it and they're like, I'm going to take it. Like, it's mine now. You know what I mean? And it's not. Just like Poland did not belong to Hitler, the gaming community doesn't fucking belong to woke people. It doesn't fucking belong to feminists. I'm sorry, but girls didn't even fucking play video games until like 2009. Like, I know that there were like 3. Everyone knew like 1 girl when they were 10 that played video games, but it was like 99% of actual gamers were men. And then you had kind of the feminist community, if you will, go like, basically my thesis is they create a sense of belonging and then they also try to co-opt other groups. They try to say, if you want to belong to any group, you have to belong to our group. Like, you can't just be a gamer, you have to be a woke gamer. You have to be a gamer who thinks that there needs to be greater representation of women in games. You have to be, if you can't just be a cinephile, you can't just be a film buff. You have to be a film buff who only watches movies that pass the Bechdel test. You can't just be a political junkie. You have to be a political junkie who only does progressive activism. And if you're a Republican, you're just some stupid hillbilly. You don't know anything about politics. Fuck you. It's like, you can't belong to these groups without belonging to their group.
So I think maybe to take that a step further, they weaponize this desire for group belonging, and ostracism is one of the key tactics of wokeness. And I'm also now just thinking, well, how do men resolve their differences? Historically, typically it's through violence. How do women resolve their differences? Well, they ostracize others and tear down their reputation. So in a lot of ways, these tactics are, again, this isn't a universal statement, but in general, more commonly practiced among women seeking power, revenge, or kind of wishing to inflict harm rather than men. And I think that's not pointed out enough in terms of there's this kind of toxic element to the feminine as well.
Toxic femininity.
And I think it is manifest in a lot of these these woke groups and the tactics that they use in terms of how they ostracize, how they use these in versus out group dynamics, and potentially just more generally cancel culture in general, where it just makes somebody so toxic that nobody can touch them.
This brings up a really interesting point and a question I want to ask that I didn't originally want to ask coming into this conversation, but it took an interesting turn. So as a society, we seem to have taken one of the worst things about human nature, and it's really more so about male nature. And, if there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, surely the cornerstone of it would be a propensity for violence in men, especially as a method of problem solving, as a method of creating hierarchies. It's just violence was the answer. What do we say now in modern Western society? We say violence is never the answer, except in self-defense. And it seems like as a society, liberalism, the liberal system, and the Renaissance thought and everything that we've developed over the course of the past several centuries has done a really good job of taking the cornerstone of toxic masculinity, violence, or just the darkest part of human and especially male nature, which is the propensity for violence. And it seems like we kind of reined it in. Like violence is a relatively rare phenomenon now. You can walk down the street and pass by dozens, if not hundreds of men, and generally know that there's a 99.9% chance none of them are going to punch you in the face and take your shit. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty amazing. Like we don't really have that much violence in Western society. We have a little, but we deal with it pretty well. If somebody attacks you, you call the cops. It gets dealt with to the best of our society's ability. You know what we haven't done nearly as good of a job of addressing and of sort of quashing the way that we've quashed violence in the Western world is the more feminine form of violence, which is sort of reputational destruction and relational destruction and the destruction of the individual socially rather than physically, what you would almost call social violence. And I hesitate to do that just because I don't like calling things violence that are not physical. But for lack of a better way of phrasing it, what you might call social violence, something that Jonathan Haidt wrote about with Greg Lukianoff in Coddling of the American Mind, which is women's, and this is, you can look, there's a lot of academic research on this, women's propensity, as you said, Peter, for this sort of relational and reputational violence. It seems like we haven't really developed a value system around rejecting that so much as we have been very successful in developing a value system in a society that rejects physical violence completely. Except one example I can think of is the presumption of innocence. I mean, that is the notion that essentially a rumor cannot be the basis for a human being's punishment in the eyes of society. There has to be some kind of evidence. I think that is one way in which society went, oh, this sort of feminine value where you might start a rumor because you want to say like, oh, Becky, fucked my boyfriend. I'm going to say she fucked the whole football team. It's like, and that way her reputation is destroyed. In a liberal society, people would ask, can you prove she fucked the whole football team? Like I just asked 3 guys on the football team. They said they never fucked her. You know what I mean? Like presumption of innocence, baby. She's innocent until proven guilty. And on a macro scale, we have seen that one attempt by our society to kind of reject that sort of reputational destruction. We're seeing that torn down.
Well, I think this, when you say it's social violence perpetrated by women, I mean, men do this too, right? Mm-hmm. It's just not kind of as common, and it's not in the kind of standard toolkit that a lot of men seem to be wired with, as opposed to physical violence and aggression. So I think, the founding fathers potentially recognized this as a human trait, but, back then what they were primarily dealing with was men, in terms of people who were free agents in society who could sort of have the capacity for doing destructive actions. And I think this whole world of, well, hey, now women get to do destructive things too is relatively new to us. I mean, it's potentially kind of on the books, maybe been around for a century in terms of socially and culturally. It's really 40, 50 years. So it's only a few generations of women who have had total kind of freedom and independence to act badly, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I think it's new, and I think that's part of why we're struggling to deal with it, and why we've seen this decline in violence, but we haven't seen sort of a commensurate decline in, say, social violence.
The only physical violence I think we're seeing is with Antifa. So that maybe alpha male is not the right word, but the men in these woke movements maybe would gravitate towards that sphere. But again, I don't think that even compares to the psychological damage that I think you guys are speaking to.
Yeah, well, I think Antifa is actually a good example of a couple things we've talked about. So I would call that like religiously protected violence, in that the media doesn't really report on it the same way they report on other violence. The police don't really deal with it the same way they deal with other violence because it's woke violence, and so it's kind of okay.
Same
It's
thing
like,
with
oh,
burden of
they're
proof.
violent, but they're only attacking Nazis, right? And it's like, nope, they're attacking Andy No, who is a 5'5" gay Asian man. He's also a journalist. He's not a Nazi. But even if they were attacking Nazis, it's like, no, it's if society's going to reject violence, we would reject woke violence too. But there's sort of that religious protection aspect of like, oh, it's woke. If it's woke, you could call it the woke Band-Aid. It's anything that has anything wrong with it. Just put the woke Band-Aid on it, and then it's good, including violence.
Same thing with the burden of proof with Kavanaugh.
Yeah, it's
Similar to
like
that,
if you
same
accuse anyone of anything else, if you accuse someone of theft or murder or whatever, it's like there aren't really strong identity politics contours to those accusations. So people will be like, oh, where's your evidence? But if you accuse them of rape, then there's the gender politics aspect, right? Because usually rape is something a man commits to a woman. And so because it has that identity politics aspect, it's a woke thing. And if it's a woke thing, it's going to get fucked up, as the presumption of innocence and our general handling of sexual misconduct allegations has gotten.
So maybe to tie this back to what we were talking about earlier, Scott, you mentioned that, kind of liberalism had this opening. And potentially this opening was when sort of our foundational documents were written, when these institutions were originally created. We really weren't thinking about women as much. And that may be kind of that opening that the woke movement has found, that there's this kind of whole other avenue of attacking people, of grabbing power that just had minimal shielding, where it's like, oh, you could kind of go through the standard route of trying to gain power, but there's so many checks and balances in the system and counterweights. But if you go down this kind of social violence avenue, well, you can gain a lot of power really quickly because there just aren't the same level of institutional protections. Yes, we have the innocent until proven guilty, but that's kind of one of potentially, say, a brand new Bill of Rights that we would need in order to protect us from some of these tactics. So I think potentially part of the solution is talking about it, making people more aware, and realizing that it's coming for them. Like, if it continues to spread, it's, how many times have I guess recently heard it's like, oh, well, that's just, white girl feminism or upper middle class feminism or whatever else. Like it's kind of making its way kind of down that pecking order. And I think as more and more people see that, they'll see the dangers of it and hopefully support some sort of legal or even constitutional protections against some of these tactics. I certainly, off the top of my head, am totally unqualified to talk about what some of those might be. But I think we have kind of come on this idea that there is this hole in the foundations of our liberal democratic society that identity politics and wokeness have been able to exploit.
Yeah, I mean, I would point out that back then we lived in an honor culture in the days of the founding fathers, right? And so, if I'm not mistaken, maybe that was the era of dignity culture, but I think it was honor culture. So I'm going to go with that. And in an honor culture, the use of any kind of social violence would have came off as so petty. Like if Benjamin Franklin had said, like, I heard that George Washington, fucked like 9 people or like is promiscuous, has venereal diseases. If he'd gone down like the Valley Girl rumor route, he would have been assailed for being a petty fucking asshole. That wasn't really a problem back then so much as Andrew Jackson shooting someone in the face. That was more what you had to deal with, was real male inspired violent rage. Like Andrew Jackson, the former president of the United States, saying like, this guy pissed me off. I'm not going to start a rumor about him. I'm gonna fucking shoot him.
Yeah.
And so I think there maybe was a blind spot because people women weren't equal back then. They didn't have any fucking rights. And so nobody anticipated that they could have an impact on our society because at the time they kind of couldn't. And So there's kind of this blind spot to something that is a part of human nature, but it's not really so much a part of male nature. It is a little bit, as you pointed out before, but it's more so a part of female nature. And so we addressed, the worst aspect of male nature, which, to be sympathetic and fair to women, the male one is worse. Like, I would rather live in a world, right? So I'm glad I'm alive now, where the problem is maybe I'll have my reputation ruined, not that someone's going to shoot me in the chest. You know what I mean? Like that. Like, I'd rather have to deal with, I'd rather have to deal with, what's her face? Christine Blasey Ford than Andrew Jackson. You know what I mean? Like, if one of them is going to come after me with everything they got, I'll deal with the former. But, so it's like, I'm glad that we dealt with the real male physical violence thing first, but now we have to address the fact that we have rightfully, just to emphasize in the eyes of all three of us, I'll speak for us all, we have rightfully enfranchised women as a part of our society. Now we have to deal with the worst aspects of that. There are a lot of great aspects. You get all of the positive aspects of femininity, like the compassion that women inherently have as childbearers. You get that as a part of our society. I think that the gay rights movement, to a large extent, has been spurred by the fact that women have more compassion for gay people. They don't have the same disgust reaction that men have. And I think that's overall been a good thing. I think that we were terrible to gays in the past. And I don't even talk about gay marriage. I'm talking about gay people getting the shit beat out of them. So, I think that you get these positive aspects of the enfranchisement of women, and I'm glad it happened. Now we have to deal with the bad stuff, which is that now that women have been enfranchised, their version of violence, which is not really violence, it's sort of, this social violence that we're talking about, their version of, them at their worst has become somewhat unregulated.
I would say that I agree with a lot of that. My only modification would be that a lot of the downhill has occurred because of a lack of clear values that they used to have in the past. We were far more homogenous at that time. So regardless of whether women had the right to vote or not, even afterwards, there was still more unity, I think, in the country. And I'm not going to say it's multiculturalism necessarily. It's just the ideas, the clear ideas we had, the clear values we had started to give way to subjectivism, postmodernism, the idea that everyone has their own civil rights fight. And a lot of these ideas have kind of infiltrated various groups, and we become isolated from each other. So you can have a multicultural society, I believe, and still have unity. It's just each of those communities needs to have a clear vision for their lives, and it has to align with our constitutional reality.
So I think that's definitely true. I think specifically there is, though, something different about wokeness in terms of its being kind of all about power and power grabs, because even if values are clear or muddled, if you have a way of creating discourse and reaching consensus, or even just saying, well, hey, there's trade-offs, like you're going to win on that, I'm going to win on that, you're going to lose on that, I'm going to lose on that, and just having the kind of that rational discussion of, well, like we're kind of better off all together as a society, even though it's there's lots of things that we just totally don't do differently, and I think that's a stable way of doing it. I think where the problem comes in is when it becomes about power and when it becomes about seizing power through avenues by which there's no checks on that power. Okay. And I think if we have a society that is multicultural, that has sets of values, even if those values aren't great for a lot of people, if you can talk to those people, and you can say, well, hey, I think this is potentially where you might be going wrong, or here's a better way to look at the world, and they'll actually listen. Then we can kind of have this meritocracy of ideas and values where people can actually, even if they're not physically coming together, they can say, oh, well, okay, I get that, you have this kind of competing set of virtues, and this is what you think is important. And actually there's a lot of commonality already. So, you kind of go live in your city, your way, and I'm going to stay here, and we're not going to try to seize the reins of power and force the other to do things my way.
So what you're pointing out is the idea that this is a type of virus of a woke psychological fascism that they're trying to infect people with, and to overturn power through those means. And so it's a feminine or feminized tactic of psychological manipulation to achieve the power flip.
I'm struggling to understand exactly what you were going for. I mean, perhaps to clarify, at least what I'm thinking right now is that there's kind of this woke set of tactics for gaining power very quickly, and that has emerged from what seems to me a very feminine form of violence. Feminine in a very broad sense. With this social violence that we've been talking about, and our system wasn't designed with social violence in mind, and so there aren't the checks on that power, and so kind of whoever wants it, like it's not necessarily a coherent group, just whoever wants it can climb that power ladder very, very quickly by sort of abusing these holes in the system and seizing power through this identity politics, social violence set of tactics.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I agree, but I also think that if we were to enforce the principles of the Constitution and the ideas of free speech, I can see what you're saying and that there's a loophole. It's a psychological mind game I think we're playing, and I don't see an additional law clarifying those principles would be the solution. I think fighting, well, that's a good question, is how do we fight back, and how do you deprogram the woke generation? And I would say it's a psychological battle. It's a conversation that needs to happen, and that we're part of that conversation. But maybe if you guys could offer more clarity on what you think legislatively that wasn't in place at the beginning of the country, that could be in place now, that would remedy or at least address or mitigate.
That's a big question. Like, what do we propose to deal with sort of, as I said before, the exhaust pipe in the Death Star, which, although maybe calling our Western culture the Death Star isn't the best metaphor, but but it's like, yeah, what do we do? You know what? I want to say that is a topic maybe for another podcast. I think that we did good today. We're at about an hour, but we do want to move on to something we promised we would do, which is a question and answer section of today's podcast. And we're going to finish up with that. We got a few questions. I think we have like 5 questions from you guys. Thank you to everyone who proposed a question. We released a video a week or two ago, I think about a week ago, asking for fans of the podcast to leave us some questions as a celebration of getting 500 subscribers. We thought we would just, do a question and answer with you guys. A few of you responded, so we're going to go ahead and answer those now. And yeah, I mean, just so everyone knows, we're sitting right now at the time of recording this podcast at over 600 subscribers. So the channel is growing very, very quickly. And, before we move on to the questions themselves, I just want to thank everyone who's subscribed to the channel, whether it's through our video essays or our podcast. Please stay engaged. Let us know what you thought of today's episode in the comments down below. Make sure you like today's episode. Make sure you subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. And, thank you for being engaged with our content. We're looking forward to hitting 1,000 subscribers soon in the next couple months or so. And yeah, we're looking forward to keeping this train rolling. But now we're going to move on to the question and answer section of today's show. So stick around for that.
All right, moving on to the Q&A. I've got our questions here. So the first question comes from username MeMeMeMMM, who asks, what is your connection with the actual IDW, if any?
So that is a good question. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, but Jack and Peter have no real connections to the actual IDW.
That's right.
I have some very sort of tangential ones. So for fear of doxing myself, I'll just say I was in the College Democrats in college. I found myself in a sort of red pill moment / political awakening moment where I did something that caused a bit of a stir in the College Democrats. And I ended up in my travels, without actually going on his show, but during that time, I ended up interacting with Dave Rubin in such a manner that he came to my defense, let's say, and we had some interactions. So I've since, emailed back and forth a couple times with his executive assistant. I even mentioned the podcast and some of the ideas we've discussed, and she was actually really responsive and even said that, she had discussed some of the emails that I've sent her with Dave and that he appreciated them, which was nice to hear, and that he might want to, hang out if he's ever in Chicago, which is really cool. So, I've interacted with Dave Rubin a little, sort of, never face to face. And and I wish I could go into more detail, but for fear of doxing myself, I'm unable to do so. I also have a friend who is a former employee of Ben Shapiro's. He used to write at the Daily Wire. So in that way, I'm sort of tangentially related to Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin. I don't have any other connections, though, really, with the IDW. And Jack Peter, you guys don't have any?
None.
Yeah, so that's really our only connection. I mean, we're just kind of, we sort of consider ourselves part of the movement. We've been a part of the sort of meetup groups and to a certain extent organizing the meetup groups that have propped up on meetup.com so people can, meet in person and have these conversations. And one day we were like, hey, let's do a podcast. So, we're just kind of doing this podcast, trying to stick with the ideas that have made this group so vital in the culture war, and we think it's very important. And we don't really have strong connections, but we hope to change that. I mean, obviously, as our audience grows, I think that the plan is, we would love to have Dave Rubin on the show. We would love to have Jordan Peterson on the show. But of course, sitting at 600 subscribers, which we are very grateful for and very excited about, that's just not really a big draw, for someone like Jordan Peterson, for instance. He's not going to do our show until we grow our audience. So, the more that you grow us as a channel and as a podcast, the more likely it is that we will develop those connections, but we don't really have them as of yet. I have some very tangential ones with Shapiro and Rubin, but that's it.
All right. Our next two questions come from username Exploder69. And the first part of the question is, are hierarchies an inevitable aspect of human society? And the second question is, what does Jordan Peterson's propensity to cry publicly say about his humanity?
Those are two really interesting questions. I'm going to start with the Peterson one, actually, and then I'll try to work my way back to the hierarchy one. Peterson, I really appreciate the fact that he has cried in numerous interviews that he's done, because I think it's interesting that Peterson is sort of this masculine icon. He's an icon for, male self-help and male self-determination and just sort of being male, like in the 21st century, in an age where it's weird to be male and be connected to your masculinity. And yet Peterson, he cries, and he doesn't do it in a way that I see as weak. And I think it's possible to be somebody who just cries all the time and it's just kind of a weak little bitch. But I don't see Peterson as being that way, because Peterson's talked about this. There's a difference between vulnerability and weakness. And I think we may have discussed this in our Jordan Peterson episode of the podcast that we did. Peterson is somebody who I think his propensity to cry in public says about him that he is not a weak person, but he is a fairly vulnerable person. This is somebody who has shared a lot of things about his life with the world. He's not afraid to be vulnerable. His book has some very personal things in it, if you read 12 Rules for Life. And recently he's been, struggling with a health scare somewhat publicly, in that he had to disclose, that he had to go into rehabilitation for prescription drug problems. I think what it says about his humanity is just that he's somebody who's not afraid to be vulnerable, despite the fact that he's seen as this overtly masculine figure. And I think that's something really, really wonderful, because when Peterson cries, it has almost always been out of joy. And I think that that's something so awesome, is that there's nothing wrong with crying tears of joy. Like if you cry all the time because you're upset, you can kind of end up just kind of being a bitch. But nobody wants to be that guy. But Peterson cries because he thinks about, this is the other part of my answer to this question, would be what it says about Peterson's humanity that he cries so much is he's been through some shit these past couple of years. That's what it says. The fact that he cries in interviews is just showing that he has been through something that I don't think anyone else on planet Earth can really relate to. There is nobody else who's really been through what he's been through, the hit pieces, the praise and the hate, the being looked to as somewhat of a messianic figure, being the de facto figurehead of the IDW. I mean, I think that he's just been through some shit and that it affects him emotionally. And you see that. And I think that's a big aspect of it, is just the guy is emotional because he's been through some really emotional stuff. His wife's illness notwithstanding, just the thing that happened to him starting in 2016. Hard to think, it's been almost 4 years. But it's just been very emotional for him. And I'm glad that he shows to his audience, like, hey, if you ever go through something like what I've been through, it's okay to cry. like it's some things justify crying, even for men. The hierarchy one, that was the other part of that question, right? Was our hierarchies an inevitable part of human society? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I for lack of a, we can't dedicate a whole show to it, but I did want to address, both of the guys' questions. I would say the only society in which you wouldn't have hierarchies is like weird anarcho-communism, and that's kind of the opposite of what the IDW stands for. It's like I think even primates have hierarchies. It's just like it's there. It's some people are going to be bigger, stronger, smarter, and they're going to be in positions where they're given more resources or they're given more authority, and you need to have that because if the strongest, smartest people aren't taking care of shit, and you're just saying like, oh, we're all equal, but at the same time, there's of course always the threat of tyranny, because the strongest, smartest people at the top of the hierarchy can start taking too much and mistreating their subjects, and so goes the history of humanity.
Yeah, I mean, hierarchies are a part of society, and you have to accept that reality. You can create safe spaces, you can create bubbles, or you can create communities that maybe are more leveled and don't feature kind of the worst aspects of hierarchy or competition. But inevitably, society is built on that. Our workforce and our economy is built on competition and hierarchy. It can be fun, it can be playful, it can also be awful, but that's just something you have to face. Regarding the Jordan Peterson question, I think it's a far more healthy way to express your feelings by crying than it is by drinking yourself into a stupor.
Yeah.
I talked about a quote earlier where he talks about self-consciousness and about being vulnerable and about adulthood, and that's all the same package. Being vulnerable is a strength, not a weakness. So I think he's a shining example of masculinity and something we can look to.
Great answers. Well, moving right along.
Peter, you don't want to have any say on that one. You just want to ask the question.
I thought your answers were spectacular. Perhaps the only thing I'd add with regards to hierarchies is that perhaps a little more color on why they might be inevitable. Mm-hmm. So first, it gives people a game to play, right? It's part of just building a narrative of your life is climbing a hierarchy. That's a kind of a default path that you can assume. And as long as society has these hierarchies and kind of people to climb them, it's like burdens to bear, as Peterson might say. I think they serve a very practical and useful purpose, and perhaps channel some of our more destructive or competitive instincts into a more pro-social channel. So I think in that regards, they serve a very important purpose beyond sort of just being a consequence of human nature. I think they have emerged to both fulfill many of our needs, but also to constrain some of our worst aspects.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Yeah. What's next?
All right. Our next question comes from...
I think it was FILMJESMAN. Let's just spell it out. That's all we're going to do for that one.
Yes.
But thank you for your question. What is it again?
Which is actually an interesting question that we've discussed a little bit on the podcast before, but kind of the general idea is what are our predictions for the political and cultural landscape in the coming decade?
I'm going to say, this is something that I say a lot. It's going to eventually get better. I do. I just think it's in human nature that eventually logic and reason win the day. But it's going to get a fuck of a lot worse first. I just keep saying, it's going to get really, really bad. I thought maybe we bottomed out during, the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, because it seemed like some things recently, like Ricky Gervais hosting the Golden Globes or whatever. It seems like most of the really woke candidates for president aren't going to win. So it's oh, maybe we're on the rebound. I don't know. I don't think so. I think that over the course of the next decade, I think we're going to see woke supremacy kind of continue its march. And at some point is going to be a huge, just backlash. And I mean beyond Trump winning the 2016 election. Some kind of reckoning is going to happen where there's just going to be a boiling point. and it might get ugly. I hope it doesn't. I hope I'm wrong. You know what I mean? Like, I hope that like tomorrow, just like all of the woke supremacists lay down their arms. They're just like, we give up on the anarcho-communist, experiment. But I think that things are going to get really crazy and really divisive and really polarized and really bad for at least the next couple years. And then I think by 2030, there will have been some kind of, I think even as soon as like 2024, like once Trump's out of office, which could be very soon, but it could also be another 4 years or so. I think that just having that very polarizing figure out of the way, if you have a president who's relatively moderate, who comes in, especially I think a moderate Republican would be nice. You have somebody like that come in. I've always said like, maybe Nikki Haley, Dan Crenshaw, somebody like that. And they just sort of return things to normal. They return a sort of soft cultural conservatism to the center of who we are as a nation. I think that in the next 5 years, you could see things get better in terms of the culture war and sort of get back to, like basically at some point, there has to be a moment where there's a mass awakening in a society where I think they found out in a survey that like 92% of people have a negative view of the term political correctness. At some point, that 92% of people has to wake up, because clearly they're not fucking awake yet as to how bad things are. Because if they were, they'd be overpowering the 8% that like political correctness and woke nonsense. So I think basically we're in a time where more and more people are waking up. It's like the Matrix. People are getting that thing in the Matrix pulled out of the back of their head. They're waking up. I did it. Dave Rubin did it. A lot of us are doing it. And I think that's going to happen a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And then eventually, this is also why they say taking the red pill, right? Comes from the Matrix. I think enough people will be red pilled. And we just need to keep doing this thing where we red pill people. Dave Rubin does a good job of it. Jordan Peterson does a good job of it. I like to think we've done a half decent job of it, obviously on a much smaller scale. I think eventually you red pill enough people, could be in the next like 5 years, that finally you reach critical mass in terms of people getting them, putting out there that they're not okay with this shit, with this woke nonsense, with woke supremacy, that eventually you reach that critical mass and it all starts to go back and we start to fix things. But we haven't reached that critical mass quite yet. I don't think we have.
Yeah, two trends that seem positive on the surface would be the anti-establishment trend, and which has been around for decades, but has really leveled up recently, and that is in response to, that is in the election of Donald Trump being a national populist, and then the rise of Bernie Sanders, a socialist. And so the anti-establishment trend makes sense to me. The anti-woke trend, which is what we're a part of, makes sense to me. But these are both anti-movements. We have to make sure that there's a pro-something at the end of that. So to say we want to get rid of the establishment, I agree. I don't like a lot of what the establishment represents, and there's obviously a backlash to it. That's what we're seeing today. But what is the replacement? And what is the replacement for removing the woke culture? Arguably, you go back to status quo. But I think maybe the status quo was just a postmodern subjective reality that we lived in, and we were floundering, and then social media and all these avenues were created over time to lead to this kind of monstrosity that we're dealing with. So I don't know. The trend is, I think, I see positives, but I see if we don't have a replacement for what exists, then we're going to have serious problems down the line.
I think it's an excellent point, Jack. I just want to jump in real quick before Peter jumps in. I just wanted to say, yeah, I was talking about how we need to red pill people and destroy wokeness. There needs to be something that we propose, like, what I mean? And maybe that's just, we say like, hey, remember those classical liberal values we had that built up Western society? Maybe we do that shit. But, we were kind of talking earlier today in today's episode that we probably need to have some new ideas as well. And I think that is a big part of the job of the intellectual dark web, just to be on brand, is that we need to have some ideas about how to keep our society together and moving forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of those points. I think there are certainly a lot of groups that have, progressive and sort of the truest sense of human progress and betterment of humanity. I think there are some groups out there promoting these values. I think you certainly see aspects of it in the tech community. And I would say perhaps the non-establishment tech community in a lot of places, people who are, say, techno optimists, or who do believe that technology is the path forward to a better future, as it really has been over the last 300 years. It's been both the development of better ideas, better institutions, but also better technology, better sanitation. And I think the two in some ways go together hand in hand. And while there are certainly many problems that we're dealing with as a result of technology, I think the fact that we can record this podcast and put it out to a broad platform, I think really speaks to a lot of potential for positive changes. And I think there are certainly kind of many communities scattered around the world who are proposing new, positive, constructive values for the betterment of humanity. So hopefully in the next decade, some of those more positive visions, kind of both remembering the important things that potentially we've forgotten from the past that we should remember and should hold on to. I think there are a lot of, we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater in the case of the West. I think there are a lot of terrible, terrible things that were perpetrated by Europe and the West and the U.S. I mean, even in the last century. And I think we should recognize those, we should talk about those, and we should move past those without entirely getting rid of the whole tradition. So I think it is this mix of looking to the betterment of humanity, looking for progress in kind of the truest sense, but also kind of remembering in that spirit of conservatism, what were the great things that we had, so that we don't just throw out really fundamental, foundational institutions and ideas while we seek to progress forward. And I think this is just kind of a classical struggle between progressives who want to move things forward and who want to change, and conservatives who want to keep things the same. And I think this tension and dynamic between the two, as long as it's kind of functioning in a healthy manner, is really the best path forward, as long as there's discourse, as long as there's free speech, as long as the two sides are actually talking to each other. So it might be a messy decade, but I think in 2030 we will look back on 2020 and marvel at how much progress we've made in that truest sense. So our next question comes from Ivan Dimitrov. And he asks, more broadly, what are some of our thoughts on current geopolitical events? So we tend to focus on what's going on in U.S. politics, U.S. culture, U.S. institutions, but these exist in a much broader geopolitical context. So always interesting to bring some of that up.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that comes to mind was the U.S. military strike that killed General Soleimani of the Iran Royal Guard. I think that's what they're called, which I believe is their elite military unit. And yeah, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, I don't think any of us are like super, actually, Jack, you're kind of into foreign policy, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, just starting with me, I'm not, without speaking for anyone else, I'm not as well versed in foreign policy as I am domestic politics. In talking about recent geopolitical events, I think of, what happened to Soleimani, and as I understand it, he was just an absolute shitbird. Like that, like that guy. There's nothing wrong with killing that guy. By the same token, you hear about how that had the potential to destabilize the region or destabilize our relationship with, countries in the Middle East, namely Iran. And I don't know. I mean, nothing bad really happened. I mean, the one thing was there was that plane. There was a passenger plane with 200 people in it shot down, but that was just kind of Iran's fuck up. And, this is, like I said, I'm not super well educated on these topics, so this is just my kind of shoot from the hip. But as I understand it, it's like we killed this piece of shit guy that did pose a threat to American interests in some ways because he was a piece of shit. And it's like, odds are if you're a piece of shit general operating in the Middle East, you're probably doing things that are against Western interests. I don't know, again, shooting from the hip here. And yeah, definitely won't pretend to be an expert. But, and so we kill this guy. They launch some rockets at us. They intentionally miss any actual people. They didn't kill any Iraqi police. They didn't kill any United States soldiers. And so, they shot down that plane, but that was just because some idiot saw a plane in their airspace. And frankly, I think they should have closed the airport, as I understand it. You're not supposed to have an airport open in an area that's engaged in an active military action, like launching missiles. And so they saw this passenger plane, It's a terrible tragedy. It's absolutely awful. They see a plane with 200 people in it, and they think it's a fighter jet coming from the United States, and they shoot it down. And they killed 200 civilians. I don't really blame Trump for that. There were a lot of people saying like, oh, well, you know, technically if he hadn't killed, no, bullshit. Like he didn't anticipate that. Like he wasn't paying attention to Ukrainian flight paths. You know, maybe that's the job of the intelligence agency to foresee those kind of logistics. And I hope that they kind of figure that out, because I would obviously love for those 200 people to have their lives back and their families to have them back. But, you know, that particular event, which I think was the big, you know, geopolitical event of late, I like it when we kill bad people. I'm not going to lie. But at the same time, I'm concerned with the effects that those military actions can have on the stability of probably the most unstable region in the world, which is the Middle East. And I kind of have two minds about it. Not super well educated on the topic, but that's my kind of shoot from the hip approach.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we have time to do a comprehensive overview of foreign policy. In the IDW, it's kind of interesting. You have someone like Ben Shapiro who it takes a very specific position, which aligns. It's more nuanced than I think a lot of the neoconservative positions were in the early 2000s. There's a lot more to what he's saying. I take a non-interventionist point of view. That doesn't mean we never intervene in the foreign affairs of other countries. It just means we need to be extremely cautious about when we do. And one thing I do is always look at the past history of our country, and we've propped up dictators. We've supported terrorist regimes to overthrow other dictators that weren't favorable to our interest. So there's a lot going on, especially in the current situation, where we've supported rebels that have become terrorists, that became ISIS, that then tried to overthrow Assad. And Soleimani was actually killing a lot of ISIS fighters, among other innocent people. So a lot of people in Iran saw him as a freedom fighter and someone that was fighting these terrorists that, you know, the U.S. Unintentionally created. So it's such a complicated situation in the Middle East. I would say I'm not in favor of what Trump did. I think he's smart enough to have pulled back and things didn't escalate. Other presidents maybe wouldn't have done that. It's hard to know. So I'm happy with how it turned out, but I don't think escalating tensions is the best way to go.
So you would have been against the military strike on Soleimani?
I would have been against, yeah, because there's long-term consequences we can't really see right now.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And what were the short-term interests in that situation?
Mm-hmm.
I get the argument that what Obama did, which is just sending money over there, is not good either. I wouldn't have supported that, but yeah, that's my position on that.
Yeah, so I might want to move away from the Middle East just because I think in the geopolitical context, you know, it has a lot of, I guess, sort of baggage associated with it with regards to travel bans and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and so there's a lot going on that's very emotional, and there's certainly the potential for larger conflict. There's a country that's actively pursuing nuclear weapons. But really, I think that's, for the most part, a sideshow geopolitically. I think the big kind of elephant in the room here is the current and escalating geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China. And I think Trump bringing that to the foreground of the conversation that, hey, China's been doing all of these things, you know, skirting around some laws, the tactics that they've engaged in. The fact that he's brought that up, made that very public, I think it's probably been, I'm going to say, the best thing that he's done. You know, how he's gone about the trade war and all that other stuff can be argued for forever. But I think kind of this change in the shift in the mindset of our relationship with China in the broader public consciousness, from sort of being, you know, oh, China's very subservient, playing second fiddle, to kind of the recognition that they have global ambitions to challenge the U.S. in a lot of geopolitical arenas. And I think this is really going to set the stage for at least the middle part of this century, kind of this competition geopolitically between these two powers. I don't foresee it going to military conflict or anything else, but I do think that it's really going to be the primary story over the next few decades. So it'll be interesting to watch. I clearly have my own opinions about the direction that I want things to go, but
Pro-China. No.
but I think there is this recognition of like, why has China been so successful? Like, what are they doing that in which they have able to educate so many people and build so much infrastructure and kind of do these things that the U.S. kind of struggles with. So I think there are certainly lessons to be learned, and perhaps China is making criticisms of the U.S. that are valid and that should actually be addressed. But I think kind of unilaterally seeing them as subservient, or this developing country is really the wrong way to frame things. And I think seeing them as a geopolitical competitor is the right framing. So I'm glad that seems to have really changed over the last few years. Okay, and our last question comes from Armando Rubio, who asks, is the U.S. economically in better shape than the rest of the world? And potentially, is there a recession in the near-term horizon?
As I understand it, by a lot of the standard metrics that we use, our economy is doing well right now. But I am not an economist. This is another area where I'm not going to pretend to be super well educated. In terms of recession, as I understand it, recessions are a part of a natural cycle of economic growth. And literally the word is recession. They grow, they recess, they recover, they grow, they recess again. And that generally we can expect one recession per decade, I think, like on average. And that recession should be, it should be roughly the size of, like I think we had a recession in the 80s that was like, it was bad. It was a recession, but it wasn't like the meltdown we had in 2008, nor the really bad one we had in the late 70s with all of the really bad inflation with Jimmy Carter. So as I understand it, recessions are just a natural part. Like they're not this terrible thing that like can't ever happen. They're actually a part of the way that our economy works, is that there is a cycle and recessions happen. It's been a while since the Great Recession, as they call it, in 2008. It's been 12 years? So I'm assuming, and this is not really statistically sound, I don't know if this really follows the rules of logic or statistics, but just sort of using what I admit is maybe sort of faulty logic, I would almost say we're overdue for a recession. And I don't know if an economist would say, actually, that's correct, or no, you're completely fucking wrong. But that's kind of my general thing this past year has been like, hey, it's been a while, it's been a while since we've been in a recession. And I wish we never had to have a recession. It'd be nice, but I have sort of been sitting around. And in terms of the implications of that, obviously, if there's a recession, I think that's going to tank Donald Trump's chances of winning the election. But, we got 9 months to see if there is one before then. And then if there's a recession outside of electoral politics, I don't really know what the implications would be that are all that big, especially if it's not a particularly bad one like the 2008 recession was. If there's a recession, it's kind of like, that's part of the cycle as I understand it.
No, that's my understanding as well, that recessions and bubbles can occur in natural markets. What one would be cautious of is anything that's artificially created. What happened with the housing bubble crisis, what happened in 2008, are things that need to be regulated from a market point of view. And sometimes these events occur even when there is state regulation occurring. Then you have regulatory capture, who's writing these laws and how are these banks and corporations getting away with certain illegal practices. So, economic-wise, people say things are going well, but I think there's a lot of instability still. There's a lot of things.
Wage growth hasn't been very good for like 10 years now, pretty much since the Great Recession, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And I've definitely, I entered the workforce officially just the past few years, and I am not thrilled with the pay scales that I'm seeing in most of the places where I work. And I do office jobs. I do pretty standard, work that you would think a 25-year-old is doing. And I'm just kind of like, I expected to make a lot more fucking money.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say about that is when there is a crash, when the bubble bursts, what do we do afterwards? And what Obama did is what many people see as saving the economy, because otherwise things would have been much more severe. The other argument is the correction was necessary for things to level out and become normal again. So, and the idea of a correction is, you don't bail out these companies, you let them fail, and you let the market correct itself and capital to kind of reflow and find where it needs to be. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's an argument that's an argument that should be had in the debates, and I'm not even seeing that happening. So.
All right. Well, I'm going to answer a slightly different aspect of this question, specifically on the comparison between the U.S. and the rest of the world's economy. And this is an idea that I've been thinking about and toying with recently. Over the last decade, we have seen a divergence between the performance of the U.S. economy and, say, the rest of the developed world, and that the U.S. has been growing faster. That's reflected in higher rates of wage growth, inflation, interest rates compared to the rest of the world. While historical standards, the U.S. hasn't done as well as, say, in the 90s. Relative to the rest of the world, it's actually performed much better. So for the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, globally, we saw convergence of global growth. In general, we saw globalization, outsourcing. This created a massive global middle class like we've never seen before. And so the story for those 3 decades was global convergence, that the poorer countries, the developing markets, they're going to grow faster and catch up to the US and catch up to Europe and kind of become more similar in those ways. And that was the story for about 3 decades. But really over the last decade, we've seen the reversal of that in a number of ways. And we've actually seen the US, and perhaps not all of the US, but definitely parts of the US, really running away with economic growth, where if you look at California, you look at New York, you look at London, there's certain places that are major tech centers that have really innovated like crazy, created giant companies, created lots and lots and lots of wealth. And really the rest of the world isn't catching up. And the rest of the world now actually includes significant portions of the US. And so we've almost seen the reversal of this convergence, where back maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, kind of through the first and second industrial revolution or third industrial revolutions, the West kind of pulled away from the rest of the world, where the West kind of developed higher living standards and perhaps not broadly distributed, but in general, things were getting much, much better in the West, whereas the rest of the world was kind of stagnating. And we're seeing that dynamic again in a lot of places, where there are parts of the West, there are parts of the US that are really pulling away economically from the rest of the world. And from the rest of the country. And I think that also gets reflected in things like wealth and income inequality. But as bad as that is sort of in the US, globally, it seems to be even on a larger scale. So it does seem like there has been some shift economically. It has been to the benefit of the US and potentially to the detriment of the rest of the world. But sort of this kind of broad-based catch-up growth that potentially we've become accustomed to seeing due to globalization, immigration, and all that, seems to be reversing. So the economic story might be changing, where we might once again see certain parts of the world really kind of living totally different lives, and not seeing this kind of economic convergence that we might be used to.
All right, so that was our last question, meaning that we have concluded the Q&A portion of our podcast today. Again, this is Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. Thanks everyone for listening. We're probably going to do another Q&A when we hit 1,000 subscribers. I want to thank everyone who's helped get our YouTube channel to 600 subscribers. And don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and let us know what you thought in the comments down below. And you can always pop us a question even when we're not doing Q&As. And, if it's a good enough question, maybe we'll answer it. For the Q&As, we'll usually guarantee that we'll answer your question. But in the meantime, just let us know your thoughts, and thanks again for listening.